Okay? So you get all quiet and then you start talking again. Nobody. It may be the Humanist Forum, but it's just like church. If you get here in time, you get to sit in one of the back rows. And if you arrive later, well, that's the way it is. Well, good evening and welcome to the last Humanist Forum of the season. Yeah, I know it does. It does. Yes, everyone will regroup again in the fall and start up again, but humanists, like other nominalists, take the summer off and go to the lake or go on vacation, and that's just the way it is. I'm Stefan Jonasson. My pronouns are he, him, and I get to be both kind of my own introducer and my and the speaker for this evening. So I'd like to welcome you all here. Most of you probably had better places you could have been. A few of you may have been mopping up your basements. So I'm kind of glad that anybody showed up at all today. With that, I'm just going to launch in. My presentation is relatively brief compared to what I normally do, and even relatively brief compared to what normally happens here. And we will have two questions. I just distilled this down to two multiple part questions for the period after my presentation, and you have the questions we'll be focusing on, and we can probably do this in 2 or perhaps 3 groups if someone else shows up. But I think the questions have long introductions but are otherwise straightforward. And they don't exactly flow from what I'm talking about today, but they're not unrelated. So I will just acknowledge that up front. Humanism and its aspirations, the third Humanist Manifesto, which was adopted on the 70th anniversary of the original manifesto, boldly declared, "Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity." The life stance of humanism, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience, encourages us to live life well and fully. It evolved through the ages and continues to develop through the efforts of thoughtful people who recognize that values and ideals, however carefully wrought, are subject to change as our knowledge and understandings advance. That's as good a definition of humanism as I have encountered. And I do like to brag just a little that I was one of the original signatories to humanism and its aspirations, so I had more say in what was going to appear than most individuals. But I think that it captures the essence of humanism. Far from being a simple denial of conventional religious belief, this manifesto, like the two that preceded it, is a call to live ethically and meaningfully through human effort alone, based on values and ideals developed among human beings without revelation or authority, other than knowledge of the natural world and human society that we discern through observation and reflection, and the authority of our shared experiences and agreements, our social contract, if you will. Godliness is not necessary for goodness. Certainty is not required for confidence. And sacred scripture is not an indispensable guidebook for ethical conduct. In fact, a slavish adherence to almost any of the so-called sacred scriptures of the world will almost inevitably lead you into some form of ethical misconduct. Not only are they not good guidebooks, sometimes they can be positively negative. Although the universe cares not about our ideals and our morality, we must care for them, observed John Dietrich, one of the pioneer humanist ministers among Unitarians. All the virtues and all the values, all there is of goodness and courage, kindliness and courtesy is of our own creation, and we must sustain them, or otherwise they will go out of existence. Against the terrifying background of an uncaring universe, we may each set a triumphant soul that has faced facts without dismay, and knowing good and evil, chosen good. Humanists are confident that the religious traditions that have come down to us are human creations, not divine revelations, each and every one of them, without exception. And we hold that successive generations of humankind are as entitled to fashion their own life philosophies and ethical standards as any earlier generation, and that advancing knowledge and understanding demands that we undertake to do so. Indeed, we would maintain that every existing religious tradition has evolved over time, as surely as our species has evolved, and that it is improbable that any extant religion preserves without error or change the teaching of its founders. This is how so many get it so wrong so often, by assuming that they somehow know what Jesus would do, or what Mohammed would do, or the Buddha, or Confucius, or for that matter, Vladimir Lenin. Nor would we consider it desirable if any religion did stay stagnant, since an unchanging tradition is almost certainly a dead one. Even a so-called traditionalist or a strong institutionalist should be wary of unchanging traditions. Philosophies and religions adapt themselves to changing circumstances, and there's no reason to think that what we call humanism today shouldn't be subject to changes in understanding and emphasis. We'd be surprised if this were not the case. And we arguably live in a time and place where change is occurring at an unprecedented pace in science and technology, industry and commerce, society and ecology, and of course, religion and ideology. As the world around us changes, so do the challenges faced by humanists. Our liberality, our flexibility, our openness to new information and insight does not vaccinate us against the need to change, nor does it save us from the changes that occur around us without our actual consent. We too are part of a changing religious, philosophical, spiritual ecosystem, and we will either adapt to it or perish, because that's how such systems, like biological systems, work. From the Enlightenment, when humanism was seen to be undermining Christendom, to the moral majority, when secular humanism was proclaimed to be the convenient enemy of Christian fundamentalists, the principal threat to humanism around the world came from religion. Make no mistake, though, reactionary religion continues to be a threat to humanistic ideals and humanists themselves. But it's not the only one. Just last week, we saw that the United States military changed its varied categorizations of religious communities. And if you were paying attention, you will know that Unitarian Universalists were dropped from the list, at least the upper level list. So were humanists, so were non-believers in general, unless you feel like we were somehow singled out. So was the United Church of Christ, one of the oldest denominations in the United States, tracing its way all the way back to the Pilgrim founders in Plymouth, Massachusetts, who came across the sea supposedly in search for religious liberty, when in fact they came mostly to be able to impose their own Puritanism on others with impunity. The US military changed its codes. It would be more accurate to say that they consolidated the various categorizations of religion into a simpler set of categories. And of course, in doing so, they got a great deal wrong. Now, rest assured that Unitarian Universalists and humanists and atheists and agnostics, because they do exist in foxholes, rest assured that they've all been just pushed down a little way, one or two or perhaps three tiers belong the big categories that they created. But in creating this list, the United States military made some questionable groupings. For instance, the Lutheran Church of America, which is a relatively liberal group that, if we were in the United States, would have been marching alongside us at Pride, it was combined with the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which has almost nothing similar to the Lutheran Church of America in terms of its teachings, its attitudes, its outlook on the world. It would have been more appropriate in all likelihood to, if they were going to do such groupings, to link the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod with the Southern Baptist Convention. But instead, they lumped the Southern Baptist Convention with the American Baptists, who are in fact a relatively liberal Baptist denomination. It became apparent that they were looking mostly for similar names and making very big assumptions about who these various religious denominations partner with. If they'd have dug a little further, they might have discovered that actually the Seventh-day Adventists and the Unitarian Universalists have sometimes made common cause on human rights issues, because both denominations care powerfully about the separation of church and state. Both want to be unfettered by government. They did keep the Quakers separate, which is mildly humorous to me, because of all the denominations in the world, that I can't imagine having very many soldiers in need of a military chaplain. The Quakers rise high on the list. And I still haven't found where they've placed the Mennonites, although I am confident that they are there although there is a similar awkwardness about military chaplains for Mennonites as there is military chaplains for Quakers. The point is that in seeking to differentiate between what they consider legitimate religious groups and groups that they consider illegitimate, it was very clear that they marginalized Unitarian Universalists and atheists and agnostics and humanists as far down the list as they could place them. And that is probably a warning to our compatriots in the United States that there will not likely be any new chaplains hired from those denominational groups or non-religious life stances. It may also be a warning that if the current administration lasts long enough, there may be no tax concessions that are granted to such groups either. Because I somehow imagine that the military's understanding of what constitutes an authentic religious community, a genuine life stance organization, is likely to be transferred to the IRS and from there to other arms of government. So much for the separation of church and state. And this perhaps is the first threat that humanists face in terms of the public sphere. The public square has become a less friendly place to humanists and others like them in the United States. And often what the trends that tend to begin in the United States make their way northward. Now, this is clearly a manifestation of what happens when the people we describe as Christian nationalists get to be in charge. And I want to say that there's nothing, really nothing, that's particularly Christian about Christian nationalism. And its sense of nationalism itself is extremely narrow. Although it does wrap itself up in Christian garb, the phenomenon known as Christian nationalism is actually a secular ideology that employs a few of the symbols of a simplistic and superficial understanding of faith about which most of its members are frighteningly ignorant. And while it may echo the theocracy of the mullahs, its followers have a shallower grasp on their own professed faith than the average person of faith in the developing world. Make no mistake, the MAGA movement, as an expression of Christian nationalism which exploits the language of faith, is not grounded in faith. It is a secular movement, supported and enabled by angry and gullible believers. At the same time, not every complaint by this reactionary movement is without merit, even though MAGA doesn't offer any real solutions to those faiths. And my reason for highlighting it this evening is because of our past history. Both Unitarian Universalists and humanists, but especially humanists, our past history of being targeted by the more conservative religious traditions in the United States. But it has worked its way not only through those conservative and reactionary religions, it has worked its way more fully into the social fabric of the United States. It has become part of the secular understanding of the world in the United States as that country understands the secular. And it is a threat to humanists, to atheists, to agnostics, to Unitarian Universalists, and it seems even to the United Church of Christ. Today, in an increasingly secular world, the challenges to humanist values come increasingly from secular ideologies in both the academy and public life, alongside shifting standards of evidence in the social sciences and the resurgence of illiberalism, even in many liberal humanistic circles. Before the fall of the Iron Wall, so many years ago, humanists were as badly treated in Eastern European countries as were the Christians in those places, because humanism was viewed as just another form of religious expression. Sure, the humanists didn't have God. They didn't have a set scripture. They didn't have the same kind of liturgical practices as other religious communities. But they were still frowned upon by the authorities, because humanism, by its very nature, is a threat to those who would seek to exercise power autocratically. The social and political left are not without their own ideologies, and these may sometimes be more dangerous for humanists because they are more seductive to us. Few people with strongly held views are able to see through to whatever errors there may be in their own foundational assumptions. It's easy, as I have done already today, to pick apart the foundational assumptions of those groups that we know to be antagonistic towards us. It is much more difficult to pick apart those foundational assumptions of ideologies or groups with which we resonate on so many levels. So there are, in fact, peace groups that most of us would find ourselves in agreement with. And there are peace groups that we might have reason to challenge, because they might, in fact, be fronts for something that isn't exactly a declaration of peace. And we can go through almost every category of secular ideology and find ways in which humanists might resonate with those ideologies, and also find ways in which those ideologies are as antagonistic towards us as the most reactionary of religious communities. Ideology differs from theory in that it is not falsifiable. No matter how ridiculous the claims of a particular ideology may seem, because ideologies are not necessarily any more concerned with evidence than theologies. And that, I believe, creates a fundamental difference between humanism and many secular ideologies which may seem close to us, but not quite. For decades, even longer than that, humanists had to remind Christians and members of other faith traditions that you didn't need to believe in God to be good. Well, that's an observation that cuts both ways. There's nothing inherently good about those who profess disbelief either. That's why we can't assume that those who profess to be unbelievers or unaffiliated or profess no religion in particular, those whom we playfully dub nuns, are necessarily allies of humanism. There is no direct correlation between goodness and belief in God, and that lack of correlation works in both directions. There are wicked atheists in the world, even though we may disbelieve the same God they don't believe in. There are even wicked agnostics, although I would imagine that it's harder for them to be as enthusiastic about their wickedness as it is for the wicked atheist. The point is that there are people with no particular religious affiliation or belief. People who can check off all the boxes that we check off about beliefs in the supernatural, or about the parade of prophets who have supposedly visited the earth, or the particular practices of either organized religion or folk religion. There are all sorts of people who fit into these categories who aren't necessarily people that we would describe as humanists. It is possible for there to be a hard-hearted atheist who cares nothing for their neighbors, who would railroad those who dare to descend on their neighborhoods, individuals who don't care that there are homeless, individuals who don't care that the hungry exist, individuals who don't care that there are people without clothing, and yet profess with us a belief that there is no supernatural. But I would argue they're not humanists. They're actually threats to the humanism that has evolved here in North America, in Europe, in India, in Japan. The humanism that has evolved over 2 centuries, that while rejecting the supernatural and seeking to chart a distinctly secular, this worldly course, don't actually agree with the notion that we aren't our neighbor's keeper and that we shouldn't be concerned with social conditions. And so sometimes those who profess to reject the same things we reject may be our greatest threat in terms of our public credibility and in terms of our being seduced into believing that they are somehow ethical people. If we were once challenged by evangelical and fundamentalist Christians in North America and by the zealots of other traditional faiths elsewhere in the world, today we are sometimes outflanked by non-believers on the other side of us, namely those whose atheism or agnosticism, disbelief or rejection and skepticism is not necessarily accompanied by any life stance or philosophy that offers them either a moral compass or a pathway towards one. This is not a new revelation, by the way. Humanists have been aware of this since the earliest ones adopted the label as a way to describe their life stance, as a way of saying that we are more than what we disbelieve, that we still believe fully in humanity and its capacity, and in our individual role to contribute to the human good. As I mentioned 2 Sundays ago, when discussing the changing landscape of religion, according to the General Social Survey of 2024, which has tracked Americans' religious affiliation since 1972, 41% of the so-called Generation Z respondents, more or less those under 30, claim no religious affiliation, which is twice the number for boomers and fully 10 times the proportion of the silent generation, those born before 1945. And the millennials are not far behind at 37%. Generation X now tracks more closely with the boomers, which shows that beginning with the millennial generation, there has been a catastrophic decline in religious affiliation. But that should not be confused with an increase in the fortunes of humanists here or anywhere else. Moreover, contrary to the conventional wisdom, the data suggests that people no longer become more religious as they age, if that was ever really the case. In fact, every generation except the silent has shown a 2 or 3% increase in religious non-affiliation each decade. If this trend continues for Generation X, as I noted on Sunday, more than half of them will claim no religious affiliation by the time they are pensioners. And this doesn't even consider the fact that many people who do claim to be adherents of a particular religion, especially when the census taker asks, never darken the doors of a religious or spiritual or philosophical community outside of weddings and funerals. And these self-declared nuns also express some surprising views. For instance, among nuns, well, I need to break this down. Among all nuns, remember we're talking about the people with no particular religious affiliation, not the people with the hats. Among all nuns, 11% says religion has no place in the world, which strikes me as a surprisingly small percentage among those who have declared that they don't have time for one. But if you break the group up, 27% of atheists express that view, 7% of agnostics, and only 5% of those who say they have no religion in particular. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Among nuns, 66% believe in pure evolution. That is to say that the human species has evolved from earlier species that are simply part of the natural process of the universe. That's a significant percentage. 21% believe in intelligent design, which is harder to square with their professed irreligion, partly because it's hard to understand where the intelligence behind the design actually exists. And most surprisingly of all, 11% of nuns hold a creationist view of the world. Now, just for comparison, the group that holds the most strongly creationist view of the world, which is to say evangelicals and fundamentalists, only 26% of them actually believe in creationism. The remainder believe in something between the notion of intelligent design and actually a significant plurality believes in evolution. What it shows us is that the people who we understand to be irreligious or not religious or indifferent to religion are as complex a group to understand as those who profess to believe in a particular stream of religiosity. And in a way, that is threatening to our understanding of who might wish to become humanists. Because it says to us that there are many people of no particular religious belief, people who are overtly antagonistic towards religion, who still have no interest in what humanism has to offer. Now, for the record, that shouldn't stop us from offering what humanism has to offer. It should just, give us a little humility in terms of our expectations of the percentage of people who are likely to say thank you. And so I come back to Corliss Lamont, one of my favorite humanist thinkers, who wrote, "To define 20th century humanism briefly, I would say that it is a philosophy of joyous service for the greater good of all humanity in this natural world, and advocating the methods of reason, science, and democracy. Humanism in general is not a way of thinking merely for professional philosophers, but is also a credo for average women and men seeking to lead happy and useful lives. It does not try to appeal to intellectuals alone by laying claim to great originality, or the multitude by promising the easy fulfillment of human desires, either upon this earth or in some supernatural dream world. But humanism does make room for the various aspects of human nature. Though it looks upon reason as the final arbiter of what is true and good and beautiful, it insists that reason should fully recognize the emotional side of humankind. Indeed, one of humanism's main functions is to set free the emotions from cramping and irrational restrictions. A quarter of our way into the 21st century, in the face of changing challenges, Lamont's definition still works for the most part, alongside humanism and its aspirations. But the landscape of religion has changed around us, and we must adapt to a spiritual and philosophical environment that's changing even more rapidly than the weather. Humanism has something profoundly important to offer those who have decided to forego conventional religious beliefs and institutions. But we would be mistaken if we thought that everyone who has done so is someone who wishes to be part of a humanist community, or even someone who harbors humanist values. And that makes our work as humanists all the more important, to reach out to those who might benefit from a community of like believers, in the hope that together we can work through life's ethical questions, its questions of meaning, its discernment of values, and together seek to create a more loving, a more decent, a more rational world for everyone. And with that, I'm going to invite you to break up into groups of perhaps half a dozen people and take a look at the first question that I've assigned for discussion. When we're done with that question, perhaps in, what time is it? Perhaps in 20 minutes, we will take a break for refreshments and then return to the second question I have listed. So this is a warning. Don't be working on the second question when you should be working on the first one. I deliberately, having watched you over the past year or two, having watched you skirt your way around the deep and meaningful questions that Chris and others have created to guide your discussion, managing not to even look at them, let alone answer them, I decided I would give you one choice in each discussion period. Humor me if you are offended by this autocratic way of assigning questions. Humor me and humor one another and focus on these two questions that we'll discuss this evening. We'll have to move them all back when we're done for harvest tomorrow. But yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, why don't I read you the question? Sure. And then, if you received the long form of the recent census of Canada, and let me as an aside say how jealous I am of you, if you did, because I'm like a census nerd. I'm 66 years old and I've been waiting my whole life to get the long form census without success. You're taking my hope from me. If you received the long form of the recent census of Canada, you would have been asked this question for every member of your household. What is this person's religion? And actually not answering the question isn't an option. So you have to answer the question, even if it's no religion, your last choice on the list. But in addition to a list of broad categories, so in the question itself, embedded in the question, they listed Roman Catholic, Muslim, United Church, Anglican, Hindu, Sikh, Baptist, Pentecostal, Buddhist, Jewish, Lutheran, and Presbyterian, and Greek Orthodox. And what I can tell you is that most people, this is question 30 in the census, most people who had already made it to question 30, fully resenting having to do the long form census, if they fit into one of those categories, they would have just checked the box. They'd have put down Lutheran, no matter which of the several Lutheran denominations they belong to. They'd have never gone to the secondary list. So the secondary list includes those denominations that either didn't make the top tier or they were embedded in the top tier. So if you go to that list, you would again see Lutheran, and you would see Evangelical Lutheran Church of Canada. You would see Lutheran Church Canada, which is a clever disguised name for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And you would have seen Wisconsin Lutheran Synod, and one or two others, and then a kind of an other.
But
So
you get the North American Lutheran Church?
no, I don't think so. I don't recall seeing. I of course read all the questions because I downloaded the complete questionnaire so that I could fill it in for my descendants, even if I can't give it to the government. So this secondary list actually refines the categories, and under the category other religion, that's where you find New Age, no religion, pagan, pantheist, personal faith or spiritual beliefs, and Unitarian Universalist. And then under a separate category, which lists secular life stances, you would find agnostic, atheist, and humanist. So it actually offers a more refined list, but what we know is that anybody who fits into one of these larger categories tends not to dig into the list to find out the perfect one to describe themselves. And so it's a secondary list in that regard. I could have called it a refined list, but then I wouldn't have been skewing the question the way I am. Yes. Yeah. If you go to the secondary list, though, You have no choices under Hindu. You have no choices under Sikh. You do have 5 choices under Buddhist. But for a lot of these traditions, the choices aren't as refined as I would make them, and I actually had quarrels with their Buddhist list as being not comprehensive. Yes. However, a lot of Jewish people would check the Jewish box and never see that they could choose between conservative, reformed, a couple of others. I don't recall seeing Reconstructionist on the list, which strikes me as a great error.
I was just going to say, so you can choose the high level, and you don't.
And then move on. You don't. The list is 3 pages long. The list of refined categories. They have their own category. And of course, like the US military, the Canadian government doesn't exactly list them under Christian traditions. So one of the good things for Mormons is that it's possible to be a Latter-day Saint and be equally offended no matter which country you live in. I think there is a list, or there is a spot where you can write in your own, but the expectation is that if you get that far down the list, you're going to check no religion. Okay, and so the 3 questions, they're actually blended questions. So think of this as a Trinitarian question. A question in 3 questions, blessed Trinity. Do you think this question privileges some religious groups over others? How would you have answered the question, and why? And if asked by someone 2 or 3 generations from now, what your choice meant to you? I was thinking of your grandchildren or your great nieces and nephews here, but I wanted to be more inclusive. If you were asked by someone 3 generations from now, how would you explain your choice? What does it mean to be whichever answer you offer? They are used for sociological study. And this is how I'll be actually talking about this on Sunday. The questions are used for sociological study, so used primarily in academic research, but they do affect policy making. For instance, in the field of education, how you answer these questions will determine how individual provinces might respond to requests for funding for parochial schools related to your religious tradition. You know, if you were running a private religious school grounded in Sikhism, and you were in an area where there were very few observed Sikhs, a government would likely decline funding. Whereas if you were in an area where there were many, they would probably factor that into deciding whether or not to assist. So it does have policy implications. I'm betting that the people who have the most use for this particular question are going to be people after you all are dead 90 years from now doing their family trees. So this is more in place for sociological reasons. Probably the most, and I kind of am sort of starting to answer the question, which I shouldn't. On a positive note, because they're asking more and more categories, if people go to the secondary list, it starts to make some groups visible. It makes indigenous spirituality visible in a way that until about 15 years ago it wasn't. It was an invisible reality. So there are positive aspects to what they're doing, although there's never any guarantee that it couldn't be used for negative reasons. So I'll leave you to your groups and your questions.
Discussion that I say, I'm not going to even begin to wrap up the discussion that took place, except to say it was very animated and covered a wide range. But I want to say a special thank you to Stefan. I always know that Stefan's got a great mind and a very creative attitude, and whenever he's speaking on a topic, there's wisdom and thoughtfulness. So thanks a lot, Stefan. Oh, that's really going back in history to animism. But anyway, we've been trying to get a humanist meeting together to map out plans for the first half of the next year, like for September to December. But we haven't been very successful in that part, but we will be successful. And we'll be dealing with a number of different topics and try to make them as interesting as possible. But I'd also like to add that we're always interested in your ideas. So if you read a book or an article or something that you think would be a good topic for a humanist discussion, suggest it to us, or better still, offer to give a session. We would just love to have that. So in a way, the great unknown is ahead, but I think it's going to be an interesting year, and we'll be doing our best to bring interesting programs for you. So have a good summer.